When Padre Pio touched a dying man's hand in 1958, the room filled with the smell of iron and incense, and Thomas Hale's heart stopped beating. Minutes later, he returned screaming about what he had seen beyond the veil of death. The wealthy waited outside for blessings, while a forgotten steelworker from Pittsburgh experienced something that would challenge everything humanity believes about the afterlife. This is the story of the touch that crossed into eternity, the vision that shattered a man's soul, and the scream that changed everything. What Thomas saw was never meant for living eyes. San Giovanni Rotondo in 1958 was a place where miracles were currency, and desperation was the language spoken in every corridor of the monastery hospital. The stone walls had absorbed decades of prayers, whispered confessions, and the final breaths of those who came seeking salvation from a man whose hands bore the wounds of Christ himself. Outside the heavy wooden doors, wealth lined up in tailored suits and expensive furs, donors who believed their money could purchase divine favor, their perfume masking the stench of their spiritual bankruptcy. Inside, in a dim room that smelled of antiseptic and abandonment, Thomas Hale lay dying alone. A 41-year-old steelworker from Pittsburgh, whose calloused hands had built bridges but could not build a path to redemption. He had no family waiting in the hallway, no priest whispering last rites, no flowers brightening the grey walls, only the rhythm of his failing heart and the knowledge that he had lived a life stained with sins he could never confess. The nurses moved through the ward with practiced efficiency, their habits rustling like dark wings as they attended to the forgotten and the poor, those who came to Italy not with donations, but with desperation carved into their faces. Thomas had arrived 3 weeks earlier, his body already betraying him, his lungs struggling against the industrial poisons he had breathed for 20 years in the steel mills of Pennsylvania. He had saved enough money for passage, sold everything he owned, and crossed an ocean because he had heard stories of Padre Pio, the priest who could see into souls, who bore the stigmata, who performed miracles for those the world had abandoned. But in this place where faith was supposed to triumph, Thomas discovered that even divine mercy had a hierarchy, and men like him, men with blood on their conscience and secrets buried deep, were left to wait while the wealthy received their blessings first. The irony was not lost on him as he stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster like the sins he had accumulated, each one a fracture in the foundation of his soul. The other patients in the ward whispered about Padre Pio with reverence that bordered on worship, their voices trembling as they recounted stories of the impossible becoming possible through his intercession. They spoke of cancers that vanished overnight, of blind eyes that suddenly saw, of paralyzed limbs that moved again after his touch. But they also spoke in hushed tones about the other gift, the one that terrified them even as they sought his presence, his ability to see through flesh and bone into the darkest chambers of the human heart, to know every sin, every betrayal, every moment of weakness that a person had tried to bury. Thomas listened to these stories with growing dread, because he knew that if Padre Pio truly possessed such sight, then the priest would see everything Thomas had done, every life he had damaged, every moral line he had crossed in his pursuit of survival and pleasure. The weight of that knowledge pressed against his chest more heavily than the disease consuming his body, and he wondered if dying might be easier than facing the judgment in those ancient wounded eyes. Days blurred into nights, and still Thomas waited, his condition deteriorating while the parade of benefactors continued outside his door. He watched through the small window as they arrived in their expensive cars, their arms laden with gifts and offerings, their faces bright with the confidence that their wealth made them worthy of miracles. The monastery depended on these donations, the nurses explained apologetically, and so priorities were established not by the severity of suffering, but by the size of contributions. Thomas understood the economics of salvation. He had lived his entire life in a world where everything had a price, but the bitterness still burned in his throat like acid. He had worked his hands to ruin building the infrastructure of a nation that had forgotten him, had sacrificed his health and his youth for wages that barely kept him alive, and now, even in his final hours, he was reminded that poverty was a sin that no amount of faith could absolve. The cruel mathematics of it all made him laugh sometimes, a dry, rattling sound that scared the other patients and brought concerned looks from the nurses who thought delirium had finally claimed him. But Thomas was not delirious. He was clear-headed in a way that only the dying can be, when all pretense falls away and truth becomes the only language worth speaking. He thought about his life in Pittsburgh, the narrow streets and smoke-filled skies, the blast furnaces that turned night into day and men into machines. He thought about the woman he had loved and destroyed, the child he had never acknowledged, the friend he had betrayed for a promotion that meant nothing in the end. He thought about the fights in dark alleys, the money he had stolen, the lies that had become so numerous he could no longer distinguish them from truth. These memories played in his mind like a film reel, each frame a testament to his failures, and he wondered what purpose there was in seeking a miracle when his soul was already corrupted beyond repair. Perhaps dying here, forgotten and alone, was exactly the ending his story deserved, poetic justice for a life lived without poetry or justice. On the morning of his 23rd day in the ward, Thomas woke to find the atmosphere had shifted, charged with an energy that made the air feel thick and electric. The nurses moved with unusual urgency, and even the other patients seemed alert, their eyes bright with anticipation. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. Padre Pio was coming to this ward today, making his rounds among the poor and forgotten, and for the first time since Thomas had arrived, hope flickered in his chest like a candle in a storm. He tried to sit up, his body protesting every movement, his breath coming in shallow gasps that tasted of copper and decay. His hands trembled as he smoothed down his hospital gown, suddenly conscious of how he must look, how death had already begun its work of transforming him from man to memory. Outside, he could hear footsteps approaching, slow and measured, and beneath them the murmur of prayers being whispered like incantations. The moment was arriving, the intersection of his desperation and whatever divine force moved through this place, and Thomas felt his heart racing with a mixture of terror and longing that he could not name, could not control, could only surrender to, as the door began to open. Padre Pio entered the ward like a living paradox, his presence both humble and overwhelming, his brown habit worn and simple, yet somehow radiating an authority that made the stone walls seem to lean toward him in deference. At 67, his face was a landscape of suffering and transcendence, deeply lined with the marks of decades spent bridging the gap between earth and heaven, between flesh and spirit. His eyes, those eyes that everyone spoke about, held depths that seemed to contain centuries of wisdom and sorrow, knowledge that no human should possess, yet this man carried like a burden he could not set down. The stigmata on his hands were wrapped in cloth, but even covered they commanded attention, drawing every gaze in the room because everyone knew what lay beneath. The impossible wounds that defied medical explanation, and announced that this man had touched something beyond the natural order of existence. Thomas watched him approach each bed with a mixture of fascination and dread, noting how the priest seemed to know each patient intimately, despite never having met them before, whispering words that brought tears or smiles or expressions of profound relief. The wealthy donors who had been blessed earlier that morning had left with satisfied faces, carrying their encounters with the holy man like trophies to display in their social circles, proof of their spiritual investment and divine favor. But here, among the poor and dying, Padre Pio moved differently, slower, more deliberately, as if he understood that these souls required not performance but presence, not spectacle but substance. He spoke in Italian, his voice rough and gentle simultaneously, like weathered wood that had been polished smooth by countless hands seeking comfort. The translator, a young priest who followed 2 steps behind, rendered his words into various languages for the international patients, but even those who could not understand the words seemed to comprehend the meaning through some deeper channel of communication that operated beyond language. Thomas watched this procession with his heart climbing into his throat, knowing that soon those eyes would turn toward him, that soon he would be seen in a way he had spent his entire life avoiding, transparent and exposed before a gaze that penetrated all deception. When Padre Pio finally stood beside Thomas's bed, the world seemed to contract to just the two of them, everything else fading into insignificance against the gravity of this moment. The priest looked down at him with an expression that was neither judgment nor pity, but something far more complex, recognition perhaps, or acknowledgement of shared suffering across vastly different circumstances. The translator leaned in, ready to facilitate conversation, but Padre Pio raised one wrapped hand slightly, a gesture that communicated silence more effectively than words ever could. The room seemed to hold its breath, nurses frozen mid-motion, other patients watching with rapt attention, as if they sensed that something significant was about to occur, something that transcended the usual miracle-seeking that brought people to this place. Thomas felt exposed beneath that gaze, his sins laid bare without a single word being spoken, and he wanted to look away but found himself unable to break eye contact, trapped in the orbit of those ancient, wounded eyes that seemed to see not just who he was, but who he had failed to become. The smell hit him first, before any physical contact was made, iron and incense mingling in the air with an intensity that made his stomach turn and his head swim. It was the scent of sacrifice and sacrament combined, of blood and holy smoke, of mortality and divinity occupying the same space. Thomas had smelled iron before, in the steel mills where molten metal flowed like lava, and men sometimes fell into the furnaces. But this was different, older, carrying with it associations that reached back through centuries of ritual and suffering. The incense was equally overwhelming, not the sweet perfume used in ordinary churches, but something heavier, more ancient. The kind burned in temples when gods demanded appeasement, and humanity offered its best and worst in equal measure. These smells seemed to emanate not from the room, but from Padre Pio himself, as if his very presence altered the composition of the air, made reality more permeable to forces that usually remained hidden behind the veil of ordinary existence. Thomas felt his breathing become labored, not from his diseased lungs, but from the sheer weight of what was happening, the atmosphere growing thick with dread and anticipation. Padre Pio reached out slowly, his wrapped hand extending toward Thomas's bare hand that lay on top of the thin hospital blanket. The moment stretched impossibly, time seeming to dilate as that hand moved through the space between them. Crossing a distance that was both inches and eternities, Thomas watched it approach with the fascination of someone witnessing their own execution, knowing that once contact was made, nothing would ever be the same, that some threshold would be crossed from which there could be no return. The other patients had received touches that brought healing, comfort, benediction, but Thomas knew with absolute certainty that what he was about to receive would be different, that his sins had marked him for something other than mercy. When the priest's fingers finally made contact with his skin, the sensation was electric and cold simultaneously, like touching a live wire submerged in ice water, and Thomas felt his entire body go rigid as something fundamental shifted in the architecture of his consciousness. His pulse stopped. The nurses would later describe how they watched the monitors flatline, how his chest ceased its struggle for breath, how the color drained from his face in seconds as death claimed him with shocking swiftness. But Thomas experienced it differently, not as an ending but as a transition, a violent displacement from one state of being to another. The room didn't fade so much as it was torn away, reality ripping like cheap fabric to reveal what lay beneath, and Thomas found himself suspended in a space that was not space, a time that was not time, surrounded by a silence so complete and profound that it felt like being buried alive in the absence of all existence. He wanted to scream, but had no throat, wanted to see, but possessed no eyes, wanted to flee, but existed nowhere that movement was possible. He was consciousness stripped of form, awareness without anchor, and in that terrible emptiness he was not alone. Something waited there in the silence, something vast and terrible and intimately familiar, and as it turned its attention toward him, Thomas understood with crushing clarity exactly what he had always known, but never allowed himself to believe: that every sin leaves a mark, that every soul creates its own judgment, and that what waits beyond death is not the comfortable mythology of heaven and gentle forgiveness, but an accounting so thorough and merciless that the living would lose their minds if they truly comprehended it. The silence was not empty. That was the first terrible truth Thomas discovered in the space between life and death. It was crowded with presences, filled with witnesses whose attention pressed against him from all directions, like hands pushing him toward an inevitable reckoning. He could not see them in any conventional sense, because sight required eyes and light and perspective, none of which existed in this place, but he perceived them nonetheless through a faculty he had never known he possessed, an awareness that operated beyond the limitations of flesh and sensory organs. They were not angels, not demons in the theatrical sense that artists had depicted for centuries, but something far more disturbing because they were familiar, echoes of every person he had ever wronged, shadows of every consequence he had created, and then walked away from without looking back. The woman he had loved and destroyed stood there, not as she had been in life, but as she had become through his betrayal, a hollow thing filled with questions that would never receive answers. The child he had never acknowledged waited in the periphery, a potential that had withered from neglect, a life that could have flowered but instead grew twisted and stunted. These presences surrounded him not with accusation, but with simple, devastating presence, forcing him to witness what he had spent 41 years avoiding. The geometry of this space defied comprehension. It was simultaneously infinite and claustrophobic, vast enough to contain eternities yet so constricted that Thomas felt crushed beneath the weight of his own existence. Distance had no meaning here. Everything that had ever been or would ever be occupied the same impossible point, compressed together in a way that would shatter human sanity if experienced too long. Thomas existed in multiple moments simultaneously. He was the boy stealing bread from a neighbor's kitchen, the young man beating another senseless over a gambling debt, the adult watching his lover's face crumble as he walked away, all happening at once, all equally present and real. Time was not linear here, but layered, stacked upon itself like pages in a book that were all being read simultaneously, and he could feel himself spreading thin across these moments, stretched to breaking as he inhabited every version of himself that had ever existed. The sensation was beyond agony, beyond any physical suffering he had endured in the steel mills or on his deathbed. It was the torture of complete self-awareness, of seeing yourself with absolute clarity, stripped of all the comfortable lies and rationalizations that make life bearable. In the center of this impossible space, there was something he could only describe as a presence. Not God in any recognizable form, not a bearded figure on a throne dispensing judgment, but awareness itself, consciousness so vast and comprehensive that individual human minds were like grains of sand attempting to comprehend an ocean. This presence did not speak because speech was too crude a tool for what it communicated. Instead, it simply was, and in its being, Thomas understood everything about himself, with a clarity that was itself a form of punishment. He saw how every action created ripples that spread outward infinitely, affecting people and events he had never imagined, how his casual cruelties had cascaded through lives and generations, how the structures of suffering he had participated in were woven through the fabric of reality itself, like threads in a tapestry depicting humanity's long failure to choose love over fear. The presence did not judge, it did not need to, because the simple act of seeing clearly was judgment enough. Understanding fully was its own condemnation, and Thomas felt himself dissolving under the weight of that comprehension. His sense of self fragmenting, as he realized that everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, guilt and innocence, was a child's understanding of forces far more complex and terrible than human moral frameworks could contain. But what horrified Thomas most was not the accounting of his sins or the presence of those he had wronged. It was the revelation of what came next, the understanding that settled over him like a shroud woven from despair and inevitability. He saw that death was not an ending but a threshold, that consciousness persisted beyond the dissolution of the body, and that persistence meant continuing to experience the consequences of every choice made in life, amplified and extended into eternity. There was no escape through unconsciousness, no reprieve through the passage of time, because time itself operated differently here, moments stretching into ages, ages compressing into instants, all designed to force complete and perfect understanding of what each soul had created through its existence. Hell was not a place of flames and demons, but this, the eternal experiencing of your own reality, without the merciful filters that protect the living from full comprehension of what they truly are. Heaven was not clouds and harps, but the opposite experience for those who had chosen differently, who had created beauty and love and kindness that would sustain rather than torture their eternal awareness. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its inescapability. You became the judge and the judged, the victim and the perpetrator, forced to inhabit all perspectives simultaneously until perfect understanding was achieved. Thomas tried to turn away from this knowledge, to retreat back into the comfortable numbness of life, but there was no direction in which to move, no escape from a revelation that had already become part of his being. He felt himself screaming, though he had no mouth, and the sound made no vibration in this soundless space. It was the scream of consciousness confronting its own nature, the cry of a soul that had finally understood the true cost of its choices. The presence in the center of everything remained unmoved by his terror, neither cruel nor kind but simply truthful, holding up a mirror that reflected everything without distortion or mercy. And in that reflection, Thomas saw not just himself, but all of humanity, generation after generation making the same mistakes, choosing comfort over conscience, immediate gratification over long-term consequence, living as if death would grant them reprieve from the weight of their actions, when in fact death only made that weight permanent and inescapable. The revelation was universal. Every human being would eventually stand in this space, would eventually face this accounting, would eventually understand that the life they lived was not a rehearsal or a game, but the creation of their eternal reality. Time passed, or did not pass, it was impossible to tell, and gradually Thomas became aware that the intensity of the experience was diminishing, that he was being pulled back towards something, drawn by a force that felt like gravity operating in reverse. The presences began to fade, the woman and the child and all the others receding into whatever realm held them, but not before he felt their final communication, a wordless expression of forgiveness that was somehow more devastating than condemnation, because it meant they had understood and accepted and moved beyond, while he remained trapped in his horror. The vast presence at the center began to withdraw its attention, and as it did, Thomas felt a strange mixture of relief and loss, grateful to be released from that unbearable scrutiny, yet somehow diminished by no longer being held in that perfect gaze. The silence started to change quality, becoming less absolute, developing textures and variations that suggested the return of ordinary sensory experience. He felt himself being compressed back into something small and finite, consciousness forced back into the narrow confines of a dying body, and the sensation was like being stuffed into a coffin while still alive, every cell screaming against the confinement after experiencing infinity. Then, with a violence that felt like birth and death simultaneously, Thomas slammed back into his flesh, his heart convulsing in his chest, his lungs gasping for air that tasted of iron and incense, and the unbearable sweetness of being alive, when he now knew exactly what waited beyond life's end.